Hello, it's Adam from the Tudor Chest here. In addition to running the Tudor Chest, I'm also the co-director of Simply Tudor Tours, a historic tour company which I run alongside my colleague Sarah Morris, known to many of you as the Tudor Travel Guide. Our first tour in 2025 is now live for bookings, titled Anne and Elizabeth, Mother, Daughter, Traitors, Queens. This incredible 8-day-long experience will take in many of the most significant historic sites in England, from Hampton Court Palace to Hatfield House, the Tower of London to Hever Castle, featuring historians Professor Simon Thurley, CBE, Dr Elizabeth Norton and Deliri Lynn. To discover more and secure your place on the tour, just head to simplytudortours.com. Dr James Taffe is a Tudor historian who specialises in exploring the activities of those above and below stairs at this time in history, which explains precisely why his latest book is called Serving the Tudors and is packed full with fascinating insight into how those who served the Tudor royal family and the nobility worked day to day. In this episode, I chat to James all about the different aspects of service in the 16th century, from helping the monarch dress to gatekeeping unwanted guests, and of course, exploring what was actually involved in that oh so glamorous sounding job of groom of the stool. To the Tudor Chest podcast, episode 48, Serving the Tudors with Dr James Taffe. Welcome to the Tudor Chest podcast, Dr James Taffe. How are you?
Very well, thanks, Adam. How are you doing?
I'm really good, thank you, really good. So you're my first repeat guest as well, because you came on earlier in the year to speak about your book, Christmas with the Tudors. You're back today to talk about your latest book, Serving the Tudors. But before we get into that discussion, just a couple of get-to-know-you questions for anyone who may not know who you are. So could you just provide me with a sort of short intro into your background, so where you grew up, and what sparked your passion for Tudor history?
Absolutely, yes. So, hello, everyone. My name is James, of course, and I live in Birmingham in the UK. And I studied history initially at Queen Mary University in London. And although I was always fascinated by the Tudors, as many of us are, of course, it was only when I was starting to research and write about them for myself, for my first dissertation, that I became, I guess, something of a hostage to them, because long after that dissertation has been finished, I'm still stuck with them. And my interest initially in studying history was to become a journalist, but that was soon outpaced by wanting to work as a historian. And I realized that's what I really wanted. And I'm honored to be the first repeat guest. I mean, to be honest, no one knows the hustle like I do. I'm here to promote, but no, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me back on.
Yeah, because you're a self-published author, right?
That's right. Yes, I'm proud of it. Yeah. I think without the benefit of having a publisher behind me, I appreciate anyone and any kind of opportunity to talk about the book. And so I'm really grateful for this, but also so grateful. And I would love to say from the outset to anyone who's ever bought a book of mine or has even just sent me some kind words, so encouraging, has meant a lot. It's the only reason I'm still doing it, to be honest.
Amazing. Have you recently moved to Birmingham? Because I could have swore you lived in Newcastle.
That's right. Yes, I'm actually between two cities at the moment. I'm not really. Right. I'm in Birmingham right now, so it's very natural for me to say that. But I still am in Newcastle as well. So, got it. Yeah, a bit of both.
Okay. And do you have a Tudor pet peeve, something you just would like to put to bed?
I don't think I have too many. I think I'm fairly. I'll hear anyone out. Anyone's hot takes. Send them my way. I'm ready to hear. But I think most will probably expect me to say that my pet peeve is probably whenever anyone says that Lady Rochford was innocent. But the words pet peeve doesn't do that point of contention any justice, really. So I'm going to resist stoking those flames, and I'm just going to stay on topic here and say that my Tudor pet peeve for the moment is whenever servants of the Tudors are treated essentially as background fodder. So whether it's in books like fiction or nonfiction, or even films or TV series, I'm surprised how many authors, writers, directors will really go to the bother of naming individual or characters, in the show, and not really meeting them out at all, not even a little bit. And in some ways, it's understandable because you might get biographies, like, so for instance, a biography of I don't know, Mary the First, who, you can get away with knowing very little about her servants, but actually throughout her entire life, her servants were her friends, her family, her closest inner circle. And in many respects, Mary is not the exception there. The Tudors in general, their servants were important to them. So likewise, again, in film and TV, they're getting better at it now, but the characters, even though they have fascinating lives and we know they had important roles in their own right, they're often just furniture in the background. The most recent example, which I'm looking forward to, but I don't know how they treat it yet, Firebrand, of course. I'm hoping the brief clip that I've seen of Catherine Parr sort of hurrying her servants to hide their books away isn't just that. And it's like not just a moment for drama. And I hope we actually get to see her set within the context of her household and her relationships with her servants, because that is really important, I think, to understanding Catherine Parr and that situation in terms of that she finds herself in, which I believe Firebrand is essentially about. But again, it's a film. They'll probably only have like an hour and 30 minutes. How much can they really fit in? How many characters can they flesh out? It's forgivable, but it's also frustrating because I think they deserve better.
Well, that is a beautiful segue into the discussion about your book, which is what you're here today to talk about. Your third book, Serving the Tudors, following Courting Scandal, which was about Jane Boleyn, and, as I mentioned earlier, Christmas with the Tudors. So what led you to tell this particular aspect of Tudor history?
I mean, I couldn't do it at all if I wasn't myself just a little bit obsessed with it. It comes from there first. It's whatever I'm interested in. When you're studying it, you're always told you need to look for the gap in our knowledge and you need to find something which hasn't been done before, which can be very frustrating because, especially if you enjoy the Tudors, it's quite difficult to find that angle. Although with the servants, and certain better historians than me have covered servants before, never quite in sort of the breadth that I would want them to have done. So I did my doctoral thesis on the households of Henry VIII's queens. But it became clear while researching that we didn't really know enough, even just fundamentally, about what it was like to serve a Tudor king, queen, or a prince or a princess. And then also on the flip side of that, like what it was like for the Tudors themselves as masters or mistresses of the household. We have biographies stacked on biographies of the Tudors, but not often do they actually go into detail. There are a few exceptions to that, but not often do they go into detail about the households themselves. I can think of one or two examples, like Gareth Russell's biography on Catherine Howard or Susan James's biography on Catherine Parr. Excellent, because they really do take the time to set the context of the household where they lived, where the Tudors lived, and who they were surrounded by. But that's what I focus on in this book. What was it like to serve the Tudors?
So you open the book looking at offices and ordinances and outline the two core functions of serving a royal household. And these are broken into, and I hope I'm getting the Latin right, Domus Regis Magnificent. I can't say it. Magnificence. You say it. How am I pronouncing this?
No. I only ever write it down, and I have been called out this way many times before. I have actually, in my head, magnificence, and I say providence, which is a cop-out. But yeah, that's you give it another go. I was gonna do whatever you said.
Well, let's try it again. So they're broken. Well, let's go with the simpler option then. Broken into Domus Regis Magnificence and Domus Providentii. I can say that one. What were these two structures and how did they differ?
You'll see now I'm not going to even attempt it. So The Domus Magnificens, the chamber or the household above stairs, as it was known, was responsible for performing the more menial duties on behalf of the Tudors. So, making their bed, waiting on them at table, dressing or undressing them, standing guard in their chambers, and so on. Whereas the Domus Providence, household or household up below stairs, they were more concerned with the day-to-day administering of provisions like food, drink, light, and fuel. So everything above stairs was facilitated by the operation below stairs. So they were very, very closely connected. But unlike those serving above stairs, which would essentially mean anyone who was actually near to the Tudors, those below stairs were not. They would never really have had the opportunity to get to know the Tudors personally, although there were a few exceptions to this. Like I think it's Richard Hill would be a great example of, a sergeant of the cellar. He definitely had a more intimate relationship with Henry VIII, but these were exceptional. Most of the time, those serving in the household below stairs or in other departments like the wardrobe, the chapel, the stables, they didn't really have the opportunity to get to know the Tudors or to be near to them. And that's what distinguishes the above stairs from the below stairs, most importantly.
So it was also during the early years of Tudor rule, during the reign of Henry VII, that the Privy Chamber was truly established. So what actually was this, and how did it change the way the court ran?
Right, yes. So, well, in the 1490s, thereabouts, Henry VII had this increasing desire for privacy, and this led to the development of a privy chamber, which wasn't like extensive new builds on palaces, but rather just this creation of a department that focused on maintaining his privacy and restricting access to the sovereign. And the first obvious sort of practical side of this was that they had a restructuring of personnel and who performed what duties. So the Privy Chamber would be responsible for the more personal and intimate everyday needs of the Tudors. But more importantly, the creation of the Privy Chamber had a significant impact on court politics. So the proximity or the nearness that servants had to the Tudors was crucial for the advancement of their own interests, but also the interests of anyone who didn't really have the same privilege of access that they did. And so there was, well, I don't know if hierarchy is the right word, but there was sort of a hierarchy of access. All servants above stairs would have moved without restriction in most of the chambers, but the innermost chambers, like the Privy Chamber and Bedchamber, was restricted more formally, at least, to servants of the Privy Chamber. And servants themselves also sometimes controlled access, depending on what role they had, and also depending essentially on how trusted they were and invested with that kind of power by the Tudors themselves. My favorite example that often comes to mind is Simon Bowyer, who was Elizabeth I's gentleman usher, and he was charged by the Queen to look into all of the admissions to her privy chamber and just basically making sure that everyone who was there was, supposed to be there. And he found that one of the sort of hangers-on from Robert Dudley, one of Robert Dudley's clients, wasn't really supposed to be and had refused him entry. And so the Earl got really frustrated by this and was going to complain to the Queen, but Bowyer anticipated this and sort of fell at Her Majesty's feet, which is how the quote goes, and sort of pleaded with Elizabeth that, he was only doing his job, essentially. And fortunately for him, Elizabeth took his side and protected her gentleman usher and saw that the regulations of the household were properly enforced. So, yes, it was a responsibility of servants to control access and regulate it as well. And the Privy Chamber was definitely the key, or is definitely the key to understanding Tudor royal service, I think. I mean, I actually did a search on my Word document right before I finished just to see how many times I used the phrase Privy Chamber, and it's at least 250 times. And that sounds like a mistake, but it really is no mistake. I mean, these men and women, they deliver like the most memorable anecdotes and provide really just terrific insight into what it was like to serve.
Yeah. And that was, I think, something else that we should also mention is, when people go round stately homes today, people often, I suppose, overlook the fact that they're walking from room to room in what is called enfilade, isn't it? Where basically, the rooms rather than they're in a row essentially, and you go from room to room, and
Right.
the sort of the smaller the room got, in a way, the closer you got to the monarch, and that was a deliberate. Again, it was a sort of a
Yes,
gatekeeping process, really, wasn't it?
absolutely. Yeah.
So, how different was the operational running of a queen consort or royal consort compared to that of the monarch themselves?
That is a question that haunted me for many years while I was a PhD student, and came up with the brilliant answer after 4 years of researching to say that they're not that different, actually. But it can be
Cop
difficult to
out.
reconstruct. Well, yeah, it can be difficult to reconstruct the Queen's side of the court because most of the sources refer to the King's side.
Yeah.
And one of the most important sources is a good example of that, the book of John Norris, who served as Mary the First gentleman usher, but also the King's gentleman usher before her. And in around 1558, he wrote up this set of instructions for his successor so he could explain to him how the household was supposed to be ran day to day. And but Norris, even in his book, he concentrated on how men served and what men had to do and how men were supposed to behave. Didn't really mention the women in the Queen's privy chamber. And I mean, this doesn't mean that he didn't know what they did, because of course he absolutely did know what they did. It's rather that he didn't feel like it was necessary to mention it. And that was because the households of queens were essentially, well, loosely modeled on that of the king. Consorts especially would have been on a smaller scale, though. And I mean, thinking about it now, thinking about it for 4 years, the Queen's household was very firmly integrated with the King's household. So it shared in all of its innovations, like the Privy Chamber, and it also was governed by the same set of ordinances. But unlike the King's household, the Queen's household had to be staffed with women because the Queen herself was a woman. And this meant that although offices had been created and developed and defined by men for men, it was found that few adaptations were really required to accommodate women in those roles. So even when like Mary the First or Elizabeth the First were on the throne as Queen's regnant, no distinction was made between the responsibilities of the male servants before them with kings and their female counterparts who now serve the Queen. So the short answer is not that different.
And actually, the royal apartments at the Tower of London, which sadly are now gone, was very rare in the Tower of London. It was the consorts' apartments that were bigger than the king's, which was, I think, unique to the Tower of London as well.
Well, I mean, one of the things I've found, one of my favorite sources being that book by John Norris, he did mention that whenever Henry VIII would resort to a palace, he would prefer that the bigger rooms were reserved for his queens, because that's where he liked to relax and liked to take solace. And that makes a lot of sense. If all you're doing is sitting at a desk and conducting business, you don't really need very much space. But if he was spending all of his time relaxing in the Queen's side, yes, of course, give her the better lodgings.
So the position of groom of the stool is one of the more well-known roles, and it was actually, despite the nature of what was involved, it was a role that was really sought after. It was really coveted because of the close proximity it provided to the monarch. So for those who may not know exactly what was involved, can you just sort of walk us through what was the groom of the stool and how did that work?
Of course, yes. So the groom of the stool attended upon the king, Henry VII and Henry VIII, in their bedchamber. And whenever they basically used the lavatory or the close stool, as it was often termed. And they were also responsible for keeping all of the chamber pots clean, keeping them discreet and out of the way, and also making sure they were always sort of in rich and luxurious condition. But, rarely in the evidence do we actually see servants actually performing the duties, and probably with the groom of the stool would be grateful for that. But there is a near contemporary poem which describes the groom as having to, quote, wipe the never end, which is, not the description I needed to hear, but that's where it was. And a good example, where it does actually come through the sources, is Thomas Heneage, Henry VIII's groom of the stool, who reported one night that the king was suffering with constipation and had slept until 2 o'clock in the morning, when he suddenly sat up sharply in his bed and made haste towards the closed stool. And he was probably shadowed by Heneage, who later remarked that by the working of the pills, the king had quote, a very fair siege, which we can assume, probably no job, as you say, more unpleasant than groom of the stool, but it was highly sought after. And that was because it was constant attendance on the royal person, always in a privileged position. And I obviously have to mention, just like before, even on the Queen's side, it took the same model. I don't think there are any records except maybe one of Elizabeth's gentlewomen as having the title of groom of the stool, but it's a safe assumption that one of the gentlewomen of the Privy Chamber for Queen's Consort and Regnant would have fulfilled that duty.
You explore the setting up of households and how this was invariably created after the birth of a royal or a very well-born child among the nobility. So what did this typically comprise of, and how did they change over time?
Okay. Well, the early households of Tudor princes and princesses sort of resembled a nursery, and were headed by a governess, most notably Margaret, Lady Bryan, who served as a governess for all of Henry VIII's children. And her letters I use in the book to illustrate the more personal and sort of intimate nature of her role in raising them, while also simultaneously reporting back on their progress to the king and to Cromwell. And baby princes and princesses were sort of to be nourished, I think is the word that's often used, nourished by women who were employed by the crown. So they had a wet nurse, and they also had a set of chamberers who were also known as rockers, because they actually would lull the baby to sleep by rocking the cradle in the night. And but those households, those nurseries, were quickly expanded and restructured whenever the prince or princess came of age. So the most obvious example is when Prince Edward was known to have been brought up among the women, as he remembered. I think it's he who remembered it. I think he's the quote, but I'm now doubting that as I'm being recorded. But yes, Prince Edward said he was brought up among the women. I'm going to just throw that out there.
It was Henry VIII.
It was Henry VIII. Oh,
yeah, it was Henry VIII.
Well, I'm throwing it out there. I might be wrong, but it's in the book somewhere. Hopefully, I'm not completely wrong. But yeah,
he may have said it. Edward VI may have absolutely said it as well. But I know Henry VIII definitely said it because
okay.
When Henry VIII, as the spare, grew up with his sisters, and until Prince Arthur died, that's when Prince Arthur died. That was when Henry VII said, "Right, Henry, as in my son Henry, you're coming to join the men now, because Prince Arthur's gone." So I know that definitely was said by Henry VIII, but it's possible Edward said it as well.
Yeah, I think Edward said it in reference to like how the women in his household, like the women who would have raised him rather than his sisters, because obviously he probably saw very little of them. But yes, I'm going to double check that. But yeah, by 1544, the female staff of the household were discharged, and they were replaced with gentlemen and young lords, and alongside like a tutor for their education as well. And if eventually a prince or a princess became a king or a queen, their households would have to be reestablished again, because they would have to be larger, but also more befitting sort of their new rank and status.
And like the households were massive. I mean, in the research that I did for my book about the Pole family, Margaret Pole obviously had a massive role to play in the upbringing of Princess Mary. And even at the point that Mary's household is being reduced, at the moment when Anne Boleyn is really coming through the ranks, even a reduced household was still about 150 people. So it was a big thing.
Absolutely, yeah. One of the things I wanted to sort of figure out was just exactly how big they were and if it changed over time. But it's a very frustrating thing, because then you have to start with the question of who do you actually define as a servant? And I'm not even going to begin to get into that, because I'll bore your listeners to no end of who counts as a servant and who doesn't. But yeah, it's an interesting question.
So you make it really clear in the book about how important petitions from nobles were to get their kin, their relatives, into households of other people. Ideally, the golden ticket was to get someone into the royal household. And this effectively proves that the adage of "it's not what you know, it's who you know" has always been around. It was a thing back then. So typically, how would this be carried out? Have you got any examples that spring to mind of a particular noble who I always think of? It seems like the Lyles were very aggressively trying to get their relatives into better households.
Definitely, yes. I'm trying to get off the habit of using the Lyles for every example because they're so rich, but I feel like they're becoming more and more like easy material. So I think people are becoming more and more familiar with them.
Yeah.
The Lyles inevitably feature in the book because they provide some of the best material for service, and rightly so. So they should be included. But some other examples do come to mind in terms of petitions. They don't really survive in a great number, but those which do, like maybe from Ralph Hodgson to Henry VIII, or from Joan Bulmer to Catherine Howard, those are two of the main examples I can think of. They reveal that often they take the same form. They emphasize their own hardship, first of all. Then they try and acknowledge any prior service that they've done for the crown. And then they sort of pledge that if they were appointed, they would remain loyal and faithful. They often tick those three boxes. That's what petitions tended to do, and that's what they kind of wanted to evoke. And, as you say, positions in the Tudor royal household were very highly coveted. So whenever an office became vacant, there was always this rush or a scramble for preferment. And really, you could petition the Tudors themselves if you had some kind of claim or connection to them that you could speak of, but more often you would petition someone that you knew at court. Lord and Vice Chamberlains definitely wielded a lot of influence over appointments, and so did councillors. And in Henry VIII's reign, it would have been Thomas Cromwell or Wolsey who you really wanted to get on side because they took care of the administering of the household. But the Tudors themselves always have a hand in who are serving them, because you can imagine that you would want to have a say in who is surrounding you, who is serving you at table. They're so close, and you're around them all the time. Everyone's going to have their favorites, and they did. And most of the Tudors, though not all of them, ensured that their favorites were kept nearby.
You have a chapter exploring oaths, loyalty, and allegiance, something you referenced a moment ago about, the fact that when you came into a royal household in particular, there were things you just had to do. With this in mind, I'm curious to know your feelings, especially as you've written a book about Jane Boleyn, because one of the things that throws a lot of people, that people are sort of eternally baffled about with Jane Boleyn, is what on earth was she thinking when she agreed to help Catherine Howard out with her nocturnal affairs, shall we say. And I've always always felt that it's a kind of a situation of Occam's razor, and that the simplest thing probably makes sense, and it's that she was following orders. She'd agreed to be Catherine's servant. She was following orders. I'm just curious to know what your thought is on that.
Right. I mean, Jane is a very scary topic to go with me. You might not be able to shut me up here, but starting with the oath. So the oath, yes, was a sacred act. All servants had to take an oath swearing loyalty to their new master or mistress, and it was treated with urgency. It was meant to be binding on their conscience, not taken too passively or hastily. But I kind of understate the oath in the book and you'll see why, anyone who reads it, because to me, the actions are often contrary to oaths because, well, they had their own free will. Just because they took an oath doesn't mean that they necessarily were going to live by it, by rule. So, but how far any one servant's life was actually governed by oaths, or say even by the ordinances of the household, very difficult to discern from the material. They do reveal how servants were supposed to behave, but not necessarily how they did. And I will agree that Jane Boleyn is definitely a brilliant case study for this, because you could make the argument, as I think you're saying, that she was put in an impossible position and was merely carrying out Catherine's orders, as you say. So, okay, that's a fair argument, but I think that the evidence shows Jane as having a little bit more agency. And I think the depositions, when you take them all together, once the sort of fallout of the Catherine Howard affair happens, does suggest that Jane was encouraging the Queen to meet Culpeper and was encouraging their sort of late night rendezvous. So that dynamic between a master or a mistress and their servant could on many occasions, I think, be turned upside down for one reason or another. With Jane and Catherine, it could be a difference in age and experience at court. It could be anything, though. It depended on the personalities of those involved, for sure. It's not as straightforward as I'm your mistress and you're my servant. And servants had familiarity. They often developed really personal relationships, and so could behave in a manner that wasn't necessarily how servants always were restricted to. They're not necessarily restricted to monarch worshipping all the time. That being said, if servants were given an order, very few would have disobeyed it, and none would have done so lightly. And so I think Jane had a lot more to she had lot to lose if she sort of disobeyed the order, but she had a lot more to lose by her involvement. And I think if she were to confide in one of the king's counselors about the queen's behavior, that would have been the wiser move in terms of like doing what was right, or doing what I mean, at the end of the day, they did swear an oath to the queen and to the king. No one served the consort blindly. You were always serving the sovereign too. And I think in terms of oaths and loyalty, Jane was loyal to no one but herself. And she proves that time and time again. Ultimately, without wanting to say too much for who hasn't read the book already, I think that does explain the role she played in the Catherine Howard affair. I think she was serving herself in that moment.
Got it. With the, you mentioned there a moment ago about the fact that servants ultimately had sort of untrammeled access to the monarch. So could intimate servants in particular, could they literally just walk in and out of the monarch's most private spaces at will? Or was there a process? Did they have to knock? Or could they just come and go as they liked?
I don't think it's really stated enough in the evidence to know for sure. I mean, certainly the entries to royal palaces and then to the doors to the chambers were very closely guarded. I think it was the 1494 ordinances of Henry VII, which essentially dictated that once he'd retired for the evening, his attendants must see that the watch be set. And the implication is that he should not be bothered. And some servants did sleep in the royal bedchamber, on pallets at the foot of the bed. But all servants were supposed to keep silence at night. They were warned, sternly, very sternly, not to be too raucous. And Elizabeth I in particular, I remember, demands that there should be no noise of any office, I think is the quote, any office near her bedchamber. And so although it's unclear, I think the most intimate servants would have been able to walk freely morning, afternoon, and evening because they had a claim to be there. They had a right to be there just to perform their duties, but in the night, maybe a little bit more restricted. A good example that comes to mind to sort of illustrate this as well is although they could move freely, the Tudors would at any time restrict access again and pull it back. So they might not want to be attended by so many men and women at one time. I remember the one that comes to mind is Margaret Morton and Maud Lovekin, which were Catherine Howard's chamberers. They would have been in her privy and her bedchambers throughout the day to perform their duties, but when they defied her orders not to come into her bedchamber at night, the Queen actually quite angrily threatened to put them away for their insolence, or essentially to discharge them from their offices. So I think it varies, but I think the rule is the Tudors were really in control of access. The ordinances may say you can access to this degree and you can access to this degree and no one else should ever approach. But we do have examples of how that was circumvented. And it was essentially if Elizabeth wanted, Robert Dudley to be in her privy chamber, even though he hadn't have specific access or right to be there, she would let him in. So yeah, I think it depended on what the Tudors wanted at any given time.
Quick one on livery. So livery, e.g. clothing and sort of or sigils and things like that was another staple aspect of a servant's role, and it sent out a clear message as to who they served. So can you just give us a couple of different examples of this, such as mottos used, colours if we've got them?
Definitely, yes. I can't pretend to be the expert in livery or in clothing or material culture at the Tudor court. I have had a lot of help in researching, trying to find my answers to this about servants, and chiefly from Maria Hayward's work, just unrivaled really in this. But I have learned that each of the Tudors had their own distinct livery colours by which their servants could be identified. One chronicler, for instance, identified Henry VII's servants as wearing white and green, and Elizabeth of York's servants as wearing blue and purple. And this livery was often embroidered with a heraldic badge or motto of the master or mistress. The best example I can think of are the portraits, which kind of adorn the cover of the book by Hans Holbein the Younger. So they're dated to around the 1530s, and one of them is a gentleman servant in the household of Henry VIII, and he's wearing a red livery coat, which is embroidered with the letters HR for Henricus Rex or Henricius Rex, and so rich and striking, just a gorgeous. I'm so thrilled such a thing has survived, because it really brings to life livery and this image of like a servant in their uniform. Essentially, is what it was. You might also find Spanish emblems of like pomegranates and sheaves of arrows sewn into Catherine of Aragon's livery. And livery could also be fashioned to make pointed statements. So when the king married Anne Boleyn in 1533, Catherine quite provocatively had her servants sort of had new livery for them all, embroidered with the letters H and K for Henry and Catherine. So this kind of defied Henry's new marriage and sort of restated her own position as his true wife, which she did through her servants. She sent a message through what her servants were wearing.
Nice. Love that.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, me too. You got to rate it. That's pretty good.
I mean, and the same with Anne Boleyn, with Ainsi Sera Granier, you know, that sort of rather arrogant.
Well, I wasn't going to attempt to say that.
But it's that rather arrogant motto that she adopts, which essentially says, you know, let them grumble. This is how it's going to be.
Absolutely, yeah. I love that example.
So religion obviously also played a huge part in everyday life for practically all Tudor people, particularly the royal family and the nobility. So how did household servants typically join? What role did they play in their master or mistress's religious observances?
Yeah, so it's definitely accurate to think of royal households as having their own sort of distinct patterns of piety, as I like to put it. And whether it was attending religious services or listening to sermons or music, distributing alms or like reading and debating scripture, the Tudors did all this with their servants. And I mean, even the ordinances of the household do prescribe when and what time and sort of how constant and conspicuous they're supposed to be in their religious devotion. The most immediate example that comes to mind is William Latimer, who served as Anne Boleyn's chaplain. And he presents this really perfect image of a royal mistress who's quite godly and is sort of exhorts her servants to fear God, to engage in poor relief, to avoid any sort of idle or vain pastimes. She's like the perfect mistress, but was kind of an impossible ideal to maintain at the Tudor court, as many of your listeners will probably think and won't be surprised to know, because the Tudors, even though they had all their own sort of convictions and their own faith that they had to maintain, they still lived at the court, which had all kinds of merriment to enjoy. So they were like two competing ideals, really. I mean, it was meant to be a Renaissance court, so you can imagine. But amidst the Reformation, especially, people's ideas and their faiths kind of came into conflict with what was actually adhered to by the sovereign. So at any given time, whoever was sovereign and what their faith was kind of what the rest of the court and the kingdom was supposed to ascribe to. But we do see in Henry VIII's reign, for instance, Catherine Parr's household having their own inclinations. And in Edward VI's reign, Princess Mary comes under fire, as does her household, for their convictions and so their own interests and ideas. So those are really particularly good examples for showing that households were religious together and sort of encouraged each other and because they lived together. And as you say, religion was such a massive part of everyday life. So it's no surprise, really.
Your final chapter explores death and mourning. So a couple of things on this. Firstly, how closely were servants actually attending on their master or mistress in those final hours? And then by extension of that, what functions did they perform once their master or mistress died? You know, was there a mourning period that they had to sort of live by before they could seek employment elsewhere? Right,
yes. So I think most, if not all, of the Tudors died in their bedchambers. I don't want to be quoted on that because I'm not sure. Definitely most. But yeah, they died in their bedchambers, most often surrounded by their intimate attendants, and they were comforted by them in their final moments. My favorite and sort of the most illustrative account of this is when Edward VI lay dying at Greenwich, and he is praying to himself, and he sort of says something like, are you so near? And I thought you were further off. And he's basically talking to his physician who is nearby, as are some of the gentlemen of his privy chamber. And one of them, Sir Henry Sidney, recalls later on that Edward apparently died within his arms. How literal that was, I don't know, but he says he died within his arms. And he also said that that Edward's death had almost caused death itself to penetrate. I think this is the quote anyway: to penetrate his dart even into his one soul. Basically, to say he took it very heavily that his master had died, and he was there till his last breath. We also see kind of a good sort of example to tack onto that when Edward's mother, Jane Seymour, died in 1537. She was surrounded by her ladies and gentlewomen too. And those women were later blamed by Thomas Cromwell for sort of having caused or hastened the Queen's death by sort of, I don't know, I mean, I can't remember the exact quote, but it's essentially like that he blames them for bringing her food that she shouldn't have been eating in her condition, and that might have made her more ill, or I think she was too cold or something like that. But essentially, yeah, that you get the impression from these sources, unfortunate for the ladies, that this is the lasting legacy, is that, they let their queen die. But it definitely gives you the impression of very, very close attendance. And then afterwards, as you say, there was this mourning period at court, and there was all kinds of responsibilities that servants had to fulfill. They weren't immediately discharged. Some of them had to help prepare the body. Some of them held vigil masses and watched over their master or mistress. What else? I guess their body would have to be conveyed for like to the funeral ceremony, and for this, servants were in procession. The best example I can think of, it's a really fantastic source, and it's available online if any of your listeners want to check it out. I think it's with the British Library, but it's a near contemporary sketch of Anne of Cleves' funeral procession in 1557, and it does show that while her body was to be transported on a hearse with like men and women in front, behind, and either side of her, very prominent are her ladies and gentlewomen on horseback, who were to be the principal mourners at the ceremony. And even what I really quite like is there's this tiny little sketch ahead of the hearse of these little seats and cushions which had been prepared with black cloth specifically for the old Duchess of Norfolk, presumably because she could neither ride a horse or walk. And I just like that little detail on there. But yes, to answer your question, they were always very, very closely attending upon their master or mistress all through their service and right until the last moment.
A final question that I've got, I'm just curious to know that if you had to have a job at the Royal Court of Henry VIII, what would it be?
Oh, I have to say, I haven't really thought about it all that much. Part of me thinks a gentleman of the Privy Chamber, first of all, because I think that had all the advantages that you would want as a servant. However, it also came with great risks, and they were often sent abroad on diplomatic missions. I'm not sure I would have been very good at that. Haven't bothered to learn a language in my life so far, so clearly I'm not made for it. You would want to be intimate enough, I think, to be sort of privy to all the gossip and to reap rewards, but not be dragged too far into like court intrigue, and you don't want to risk losing your head. So I think I would like to be in a prestigious role that was trusted, but not too close to the crown. I'm guessing something like maybe the carver. Like there were very senior, not senior positions, but rather more higher status positions like the carver and the cupbearer who served at meal times. And I mean, thinking about it, you'd never go hungry in that position, would you? I can imagine the cupbearer sneaking a few extra sips of wine when no one's looking. Probably not, maybe not. But that would be a great job, I think. Not too merry when you find that it's been tainted with poison. I always thought that was probably a bit of a thankless job, that one. Yeah, okay, why don't you try this wine first? Yeah. We don't mind if you die a horrible death. Let's just make sure it's not the Queen or the King. But yeah, so the men who served in these positions, obviously very trusted, relatively well paid, of a decent status. I think it's a good gig for sure if you can keep yourself alive. So yeah, I'm somewhere between the Privy Chamber and not being too menial, I think, is where I'd like to be. What about yourself? Have you ever thought about it?
What I definitely thought about is if I were alive in this time, what would I want? And I would definitely want to be a nobleman, but living in Cornwall or
right,
or Cumbria, as far from the royal court as possible, but still really noble. because
Yeah,
you
I
know
get that. I get that.
you the closer you are to the crown, the more likely you are. For, if we think about the men that are executed alongside Anne Boleyn, they're all in one way or another quite prominent courtiers. Whether it's as servants to the king as Henry Norris was. I think being rich but far away would be where I would want to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, those poor men who were executed with Anne Boleyn. I mean, it could. I know that some people argue that it was because Cromwell wanted rid of them, so he conspired against them, and that's why they were named as the accused. But I think it was just the fact that they were so frequently at court and would have had good relationships with Anne Boleyn, so they were often seen interacting with
Yeah.
her, and so they became the fall guys in this particular situation. So yeah, I think you've got a point there. Maybe having a nice, quiet, comfortable life in Cornwall actually sounds quite
Yeah.
nice,
The
until there's war and you've got to rally all your men together and to go marching. But maybe Cornwall is probably far away enough that you can get away with a slow march and not quite make it in time.
Yeah, I mean, that's what happened with Lord Darcy, wasn't it, during the Pilgrimage of Grace? This was a man who lived up in Yorkshire, miles from the court in London. But during the Pilgrimage of Grace, because he was one of the main northern lords, he gets involved and ends up losing his head because he
Right,
sides with the rebels in the end. Just
right.
getting back to the men with Anne Boleyn, what is interesting there? The reason I think that there is currency to the argument that these men were enemies of Cromwell is that by and large, yes, you're correct. These were men who came and went from court a lot, except for Brereton. William Brereton spent most of his time far away from the court. As best we can tell, he had almost little to no interaction with Anne Boleyn, but he did have big problems with Thomas Cromwell. So he's the anomaly, which is one of the reasons why I do tend to think it was potentially quite a deliberate plot from Cromwell to get rid of men that were causing issues for him. But who can say?
Hmm.
Who knows?
I can see that too. I do understand what you mean. I mean, he is definitely an anomaly in that
Yeah.
respect, and because they were all so prominent, they all had so many offices to their name and so many lands that there was so many rewards to reap once they died. As grim as that sounds, there were all these places to be
Yeah.
reallocated, and there were lots of spoils, and no doubt Cromwell profited from their deaths. As again, as grim as that sounds, but
But it's the reality
I
of
mean, one
it.
of the more interesting things about those who were accused is one of Anne Boleyn's own men, Henry Webb, is sort of drawn into it at one point, and he survives and he's not executed with the rest, but he's one of those who's kind of thought by one report to have been implicated. And I find it interesting to think we don't really know very much about the relationship between queens and their male
Mm.
servants. That's one of the things I'm really interested in, because they would have had more male servants than female servants, and they weren't only speaking with their female servants and only ever interacting with them just because they were more fit companions. It would be more interesting to see about friendships between queens and the men at court who essentially they were sort of presiding over. Interesting, yeah. I never really thought about that. We don't really know if Anne Boleyn had any interaction with William Brereton, do we? So, yeah, good point.
Another sort of by extension of that, the other reason why Cromwell's hand in what happened to these men is so clear, I think, is also the fact that Sir Thomas Wyatt, who Cromwell had a good relationship with, and arguably there was so much more to pin against Thomas Wyatt than the other men, because it's well known and
Mm,
well documented that he did have he knew Anne Boleyn, and they may have had a romantic relationship. It's difficult to say, but there's certainly more to pin against him than
mhm.
there was against the other men, and yet he survives, and he is the one, because he was arrested and he was sent to the Tower, but he's the one that survives, and he was the only one that was very close to Cromwell, which again, for me,
Yes, definitely an interesting argument for
yeah.
sure.
Anyway,
I would love to say more work should be done, but maybe no. It's so much work has been done on the fall of Anne Boleyn, and I'm obsessed with that topic. But I'm scared to go anywhere near it
yeah,
because people really they care about it, and rightly so. And I think that they should. And it really is such a fascinating topic. But those different levels, like looking at more detail into like the relationship between Anne Boleyn and these men, that needs to be looked at closer for sure.
definitely.
So yeah. But you make some very interesting points. I hadn't even thought about that before, about Wyatt being released. Maybe he was just so charming that they couldn't do without him at court. But
who knows?
Maybe
Who
not.
knows?
I don't know.
Well, anyway, thank you so much for coming on. This has been such a fascinating chat. And I'm sure people are going to really enjoy what you've had to say. So people, the book is out there. It's called Serving the Tudors. You can get it on Amazon. Where can people find you, James?
I am currently on X, formerly known as Twitter, and I am on Instagram as well. So feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy for you to respond in like comments or send a DM or anything like that. I do sometimes. I'm terrible for social media. I'm lazy and I'm lousy, and I'll show up when I've got a book to talk about, but then I'm like really quiet and I'll lurk in the background for a year. So if I don't respond, don't take it personally. It's just because I'm just not paying attention to them, I'm really bad. But I'm trying to get better. It's important to engage with the community. And I would love to reiterate again, the community, I dedicate this book to them because they have been so welcoming to me in a sense. I mean, you spend all these years researching and writing in like academic forums, and you know, 2 or 3 people end up reading your research. And then suddenly when it's out there and people actually tell you what they think of it, I mean, I've had some negative feedback before, which is just as welcome. But the words and the way people have sort of told me what they thought of the work that I've done, it's been so rewarding, more than I ever could have imagined. So thank you to everyone, and I really do hope that those who get this book really do enjoy it.
Okay, well, as I said, thank you again so much for coming onto the show, and we'll speak soon.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for having me.
And so that brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chess Podcast. My thanks to Dr. James Taffe for coming onto the show to discuss his book, Serving the Tudors, with us. In addition to this, my main episode, I also release a weekly subscriber-only episode via my Patreon or Apple podcast subscriptions. From as little as £5 a month, you can access all content from the Tudor Chest. To access this, just head to patreon.com/the Tudor Chest or search for the podcast in Apple Podcasts. Next week, I am thrilled to be welcoming Charlotte Bolland onto the show for a discussion all about the new exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery, 6 Lives, which, as you might guess, explores the 6 lives of the 6 wives of King Henry VIII. That'll drop next Thursday. Thank you again for listening to the show, and speak soon.